The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com.
Oh, wow. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with The Byte Show, and we are into it tonight with Joseph P. Farrell. Go to Joseph's website, the Giza Death Star.com. We are working on the Cosmic War series, and as many of you know, Joseph, he is a brilliantly gifted researcher and a prolific author, and he has produced some absolutely amazing books. He has a doctorate from the University of Oxford and has published previous works on theology. He recently moved back to his home in the state of South Dakota, where he pursues his research and his other loves and hobbies, classical music. He is an organist, plays the harpsichord, and composes classical music. And I mean, this man is a real composer. Physics, alternative history, and science, and other strange stuff. Aha, amen. With a blessing, Joseph.
Thank you.
Yeah, if we could only recorded what we were talking about before we started recording.
That's right.
Oh, boy. Wow. Okay. Tonight, Giza Death Star. This is a book that is written by Joseph. It is Giza Death Star, the Paleophysics of the Great Pyramid and the Military Complex at Giza. Boy, I laughed so hard, tears are running down my face, Joseph. Hold on, I have to wipe my eyes.
Sure.
Okay, first question out of the box. Why do you have this as the military complex at Giza?
Well, that requires some setting up a bit. Back in the late 1990s, a British expatriate engineer, he's now over here in America by the name of Christopher Dunn, wrote a marvelous book called The Giza Power Plant.
Yes.
And basically he took an engineer's view of the structure and concluded at the end of this book, just on the basis of a great deal of detailed analysis of the structure, particularly the interior chambers, that it had to have been some sort of machine. And in his hypothesis, he even went so far as to suggest that it may have been some machine that involves some aspect of Tesla physics. Now, I mention that because many of his critics have critiqued the idea that his hypothesis of a power plant type of machine, to produce electrical power, simply was inadequate because at best, on any conventional analysis, the Great Pyramid would have only produced a few amperes of current. But, this really fails to give his work the credit that it's due because he himself is aware of that, and I think this is really why, in the back of his mind, he made the connection to Tesla. He didn't elaborate it on that idea a great deal, but when I read this, I literally was stunned because I, as a boy, traveled a lot with my folks. My father was an engineer, and I've told this story on other shows, and I might as well relate it here. We traveled one year across North Dakota, and this was shortly after President Nixon had signed the SALT I talks with the Soviet Union, in which he dismantled, as a part of the bargaining of that treaty, dismantled the American anti-ballistic missile system. Well, up in North Dakota, they had built this phased radar array, which kind of, if you travel down the highways and byways around Minot and so on, you can actually see this thing. I don't know if it's still there, but at the time it was, off in the distance. And it looks like a pyramid with the top of it lopped off. And I even reproduce a picture of one of these phased radar arrays in the Giza Death Star. And I got to thinking as a boy that, gee, that looks like a pyramid with the top lopped off. And then the thought occurred to me, well, maybe the pyramids had some sort of military basis or motivation for their construction. And that, that's one of those things that you just file in the back of your mind. And when I read Dunn's book, that thought popped back into my head with a vengeance. And then, quite by accident, I ran across Zecharia Sitchin at about the same time, and I started reading his books. And the second, I believe it's the second or third book in his Earth Chronicles series, is a little book called The Wars of Gods and Men, and I think that's probably the most important book out of all that series, because in it, he cites, I believe it's the Babylonian epic, the Lugal-A, and then he refers to the exploits of Ninurta, which are two of the texts that I cite rather extensively in the Cosmic War. But he cites these texts in such a way that he himself came to the conclusion that the pyramid had to have been, the Great Pyramid, had to have been some sort of weapon, because it's described in his translations as the Great Affliction, the mountain which like a house is heaped up, and so on and so forth. And, in his reading, a massive war involving nuclear weapons is fought simply to get rid of the dang thing. Now, that when I read that, I was kind of stunned, because that meant that whatever power it possessed, it was far in excess of anything that we would associate with nuclear weapons. But what most intrigued me about Sitchin's book was that, having made this observation, he then dropped it completely. He never followed up upon it. He never referred to it again in any of his other books. So putting those three things together, my experience as a boy looking at this phased radar, and then Christopher Dunn's book, an analysis that the pyramid was probably a machine of some sort, which I think is absolutely true, whether or not it may be a weapon. And then this textual allusion that Sitchin had stumbled across and then more or less fumbled and never followed up upon. So I decided to investigate the whole idea of the pyramid as a weapon, and that really was kind of the motivation behind that particular book coming about.
Okay. Would it be a defensive or offensive?
Oh, definitely offensive. And in those three Giza Death Star books, I had in mind when I first started them that it was going to be a project that would probably extend to 2 or 3 books. And in the first book, what I'm attempting to do there is sort of outline the background case that, number one, it is a machine, and number two, that there is a physics sufficient if one examines ancient texts with the eye to look for that physics. So I go back to some Hermetic texts, which are obviously of Egyptian provenance, with a view to look at this physics to see if I can find it. And in that book, I spend a whole chapter actually trying to analyze some of these Hermetic texts in terms of modern physical theory. And I basically come to the conclusion that that physics existed and that it is somehow definitely tied into what we see there in that structure at Giza, the Great Pyramid.
Well, Joseph, that structure, okay, if it were, say, an offensive weapon, is there any indication that it would have something to do with vibration?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely it does. One of the things, and that's an excellent question, because really it's not even a point that I uncover myself. It's rather a point that Christopher Dunn makes in the Giza power plant, and that I mention in the Giza Death Star. It turns out that the Great Pyramid is resonant to the Schumann cavity resonance of the Earth, which I think is about 7.53, somewhere in there, 7.53 hertz. And he also makes allusion to the fact that the coffer in the King's Chamber is resonant to the note F sharp. If you press the note F sharp on a modern keyboard, which again I find rather interesting, because that would be in part of the harmonic series of the Schumann cavity resonance of the Earth. So it is a structure that, any way one slices it, one is looking at something that depends on vibration as its very, if you will, as its input. And the other thing I would point out in terms of your vibration theory is that in the Giza Death Star deployed, I look at the waveform of the stone courses of the Great Pyramid. And if we plot this out graphically, you will see a distinct waveform of approximately 26 peaks. And again, there have been various theories as to why the stone courses were laid in these varying thicknesses and appear to have those 26 peaks. One of the theories is that it was built that way simply to absorb the shock of earthquakes and so on in the region, and the Great Pyramid was certainly designed, it's very evidently designed, to be able to withstand some very severe earthquakes. So at least the engineers that built it were thinking in terms of vibration on that level. But if we couple in Dunn's idea of the very clear indications that they were aware of the Schumann cavity resonance, then there's some other things going on that don't involve earthquakes. So, again, this kind of physics depends on vibration, or if we prefer, on stresses in the space-time medium itself.
Okay, now I sent you something a few days ago about the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 44. And there's a mistranslation in the King James on that if someone digs down into that, the verbiage that's used there. And if you dig deep enough, you find that nothing shall be left visible. It has to do with disappearing and vanishing away. And that is the Greek translation, I believe, of destroying. Utterly make away many. Okay. I think we have that kind of technology today, but I think they also had it back then.
Oh, I would definitely agree with the back then part of it, especially because in the three Giza Death Star books, it's very clear to me, and I think it would be to readers of all three books, that by the end of the three books, it's very clear that whatever physics was involved in these pyramid weapons, and I should stress something here, and I don't mean to get off on a tangent.
That's great. Go ahead.
But in the Cosmic War, one of the things that really kind of popped out at me, and I stress it a great deal in the book, is that when we read these ancient texts, we're confronted with an interesting set of relationships. And the set of relationships is that mountains are associated with planets, are associated with weapons, are associated with gods, are associated with pyramids. And this, to my mind, was really kind of the cincher of the case of the Great Pyramid itself perhaps being some sort of weapon. Because if we go back for a moment to Christopher Dunn's machine hypothesis, one of the things that he points out, and he's very good at this, and if your listeners ever have the opportunity to go hear him speak and present his slides and things, I think that it would be time well spent, because you really can't appreciate what he's saying without seeing his demonstrations. But one of the things he does is he takes engineers' calipers, which are, measuring instruments, which are accurate to within 1/1000th of an inch, to measure the kind of craft that went into building the Great Pyramid, and particularly some of the things that are found on the inside of it. And over and over again, he makes the case that there is such a multiple redundancy in the entire structure of optical precision that we really have to throw out any idea that this was some sort of funerary monument for an Egyptian pharaoh. We have to throw out that it was some sort of initiatory temple, if it was built by people around prior to the Egyptians. Because you don't need optical precision in a building to do that sort of thing.
That's right.
But now here's where my dispute with Christopher comes, and I'm almost hesitant to mention this because I have such respect for his work. But you don't need, by the same token, optical precision for a mere power plant. And you don't need optical precision if it's some sort of astronomical observatory. Certainly not the kind of precision that's evident in the Great Pyramid. So to my way of thinking, what this means is that this precision was some sort of functional requirement of the structure. And in my analysis in the three books, the three Giza Death Star books, to my mind, the only real way to explain this is that it was necessary in order to make that thing the most efficient coupled harmonic oscillator, and there's your vibration again, as possible. And it's precisely for that reason, then, that we see so many other analogs of the geometries of local celestial space present in that structure. It's to make it the most efficient oscillator of the geometry of local space-time possible. And if that is the case, then it means that this structure somehow was designed to tap into that geometry and to resonate with it and use it for a variety of purposes, one of which, of course, would have been weaponry.
Well, what about, would it be possible, if they're using it in that way, for it to get, if they used that as a weapon, and the vibration, couldn't that open a portal?
Well, this is the other thing about this physics, and that's a good question, because if we look at, again, these texts, it's often the case that in that constellation of relationships that I mentioned before, mountains are associated with gods or associated with planets and so on, one also finds the idea of gateways. And I find that whole complex of meanings very suggestive, because first of all, it means we're not dealing with just mythological texts. These people didn't dream this up out of nowhere.
That's right.
It's too sophisticated a physics view for them to have done that. And this, to me, means then that the Babylonians and Sumerians and Egyptians and Hurrians and so on that recorded these things, they may not have been aware themselves of the full implications of what they were handed down, but that's my point. They were handed this stuff down.
Yes.
They are legacies of something much more sophisticated. Now, the sophistication that this physics has, then, means if we are manipulating the fabric of space-time, and I believe I've mentioned this in our previous discussions about the bell and so on, if we are manipulating space-time by any sort of scalar or torsion-based means, then we are at the same time in the presence of a technology that can not only be weaponized, but it can be used for communication over vast distances. It can possibly be used as some sort of gateway, therefore. So, all of these things to me seem to be implied not only by the text, but I should stress also by the potentials of this physics.
Wow. Well, what indication, we've got hieroglyphics.
Right.
What indication do we have, Joseph, that there was an ancient technical language?
Oh, boy. That is a profound question. And I think, again, in fact, that's so profound. In the third of the Giza Death Star books, the Giza Death Star Destroyed, I really explore that question rather thoroughly, and of the three books, it is by far the most technical, because the only way I can explore it is to use the formal mathematical language of topology and combinatorial mathematics. But I did so in the book in an appendix, and let the reader know that, if this is too technical, just skip it by and it'll still make sense. But if you like this sort of thing, go ahead and read it.
It's deep.
Yeah, it is. But one of the things that I came to the conclusion on the basis of doing that sort of analysis of some of these ancient texts is that there is a very clear, formally explicit, in other words, you can put this stuff into modern topological mathematical notation, that there is a formally explicit topological metaphor that is present precisely in those ancient texts that have some association with ancient Egypt, namely the Hermetic texts, some of the texts of the Neoplatonists, and so on and so forth. And I got to tell you, GeorgeAnn, when I made that discovery, I just literally sat down and shook for about 2 to 3 hours, and then was more or less sleepless for a couple of days. And I thought I had to be crazy, but I decided, well, I have to put this out there, because it just so happens, and I mentioned this in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, it just so happens that a very brilliant young Ukrainian physicist by the name of Volodymyr Krasnoholovets in Kiev did a lot of the same type of analysis, topological analysis, and he alludes to the fact in his actual scientific peer-reviewed papers that this topological analysis seems to fit very well with some of these very ancient Hermetic texts, although he doesn't connect it to any specific text like I do. And I thought, gee whiz, somebody else out there is thinking along the same lines. But what really is interesting is that Dr. Krasnoholovets was one of those physicists that was involved during the days of the old Soviet Union precisely in the Soviet research into, now sit down, grab your chair, hang on, into pyramid power. He was one of those involved in the construction of those pyramids around Moscow. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. So, this is almost a kind of a joke to Western physicists, but the Russians take it very seriously. So, my bet's on the Russians in this case.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, and there's some very brilliant thinkers.
Oh yes, absolutely. The Russians have literally some of the most brilliant nonlinear physicists and mathematicians in the world. So, this is right up their bailiwick.
Well, my gosh, Joseph, they're not teaching their school children how to put condoms on cucumbers.
No, I have a hard time thinking that that's going on in your typical Russian school.
Yeah, me too.
Oh my.
Oh boy. Well, okay. In the Torah, for an example, this passage that I mentioned to you, and in the Gospels where it says, as above, so below, I kind of get the feeling when I read that there's more than one meaning there.
Oh, yes.
That it is a technical term.
Yes.
And it's well, shall we say, hidden in religion.
Right.
Religion hides a lot of things.
Oh, yes. that it does. Well, the as above, so below principle, that's one of the best and most well-known of the Hermetic and Esoteric principles, particularly, if we look at Egypt and Sumer. But I think you're on to something there when you say that there's more involved in just replicating, the constellations by the layout of buildings on the ground, which is more or less the approach of Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock and some of those researchers. And don't get me wrong, I'm not disparaging their work. It's very valuable, and they've made a very good case for what they're seeing. And I don't dispute what they're seeing, in fact. But I think the explanation for why this is so lies much deeper. I think that there is a real physics behind this rather than simply a religious metaphor that's in play. And the reason why is if we look at that statement, as above, so below, and take it as a kind of a simplistic expression of, for want of a better term, hyperdimensional physics, then in order to tap into that as above, you have to construe the below part in a very peculiar and very particular geometric way. In other words, you have to construe it to tap into those higher geometries, or to use that dreaded word again, topologies. You have to construe it in such a way that it forms a gate. I used, I think in one of our previous talks, the example of a dam, in which the water behind the dam would represent the energy of that's present in higher dimensions, and then the spillway or the sluice gate representing the gateway that taps into those and allows that energy to flow downhill from those higher dimensions into our 3 dimensions, or if you prefer 4 dimensions. So I think that's really what's in play in the as above, so below. And I get into that whole aspect of things, in fact, in the Giza Death Star, in that very first book in the series. I think it was the 3rd chapter that I start talking about that specific thing. And then it kind of carries through the other 2 books as one of the steady themes that ties it all together. So I think you're exactly correct.
Well, what about a electromagnetic field around this pyramid?
Oh boy.
Yeah. Like we have cell towers today. Here in Vegas, we have cell forests.
Yes, I've been there, and you sure do.
Yeah, we don't just have towers here. Anyway, with that area over in Egypt, what about this field?
Well, it's interesting that you mention that, because there have always been persistent stories that under certain conditions, the pyramid can be seen to kind of give off a very, very faint pale blue glow. And then, of course, there's the famous story of the German electrician and subsequent tycoon, Wilhelm Siemens, that actually inside the pyramid decided he would run a little experiment, and so he took out a little bottle, a flask of wine that he was carrying, and he soaked a towel and wrapped it around this bottle and held it up in the air for a little while, and then had his little Arab guide touch it. And, of course, the bottle gave off a tremendous static electrical discharge. And what he did, of course, was he made a little Leyden bottle, a little kind of primitive battery. And, he was rather amazed that this amount of energy somehow seemed to be transduced by the pyramid and into this little Leyden jar that he had made. So this is a persistent story that has been associated with the pyramid. And the other thing that I mentioned, I think it was in the Giza Death Star Deployed, is during World War II, believe it or not, the British warned their pilots that they should not fly their aircraft directly over the Great Pyramid below a certain altitude. Because on some occasions what would happen is their electrical equipment would start just behaving madly, rather like the stories you hear associated with the Bermuda Triangle. And, so they said no RAF pilots flying over the Great Pyramid below such and such an altitude. So these stories have been around, and they've been very persistent. So it is generating or transducing something, even the shell of that structure, and it's electromagnetic in nature. Now, I just mentioned a key word, and I'm going to go off on another tangent, if you'll permit me.
You bet.
I said the shell of the structure. One of the most interesting things that I ran into when I started researching these works was that Christopher Dunn in the Giza power plant maintains that the Grand Gallery, the way it's constructed as kind of an acoustical amplification chamber, may have been filled with banks of what are called Helmholtz resonators. Now, these are simply large kind of hollow spherical objects with a hole cut in them like a flute, that if you blow across them, blow a little current of air across them, they'll make a musical tone.
Yes.
And, it's really one of the more intriguing suggestions in his books, because it makes a lot of sense out of that particular structure inside of the Great Pyramid. It really does have some very profound acoustic properties. And it's also clear that from his analysis as an engineer, that things that were once inside the Great Pyramid are now missing.
Yes.
And when I read that, I was stunned, because in Zecharia Sitchin's The Wars of Gods and Men, he makes a case, and I reproduce his case in the Giza Death Star, simply on the basis of texts, that something is missing inside the Great Pyramid. In other words, that something was taken out. And I kind of allude to this even in The Cosmic War, the new book, that there was an inventory of technology that took place at the end of one of these wars, and some of that technology was carted off and destroyed because it was used in horrendously destructive ways. So putting it all together, this is what I find the most interesting. Dunn arrived at his conclusions, I believe, completely independently of any reference to Sitchin. I don't even think at the time he knew of Sitchin. And, I've spoken with Chris Dunn at about 3 conferences, and he's never even really mentioned Sitchin. So I don't think that he had him in the back of his mind when he made those observations. And by the same token, when Sitchin made the suggestion, Dunn hadn't even written his book. So it's clearly not in the back of his mind when he's making it on the basis of the texts themselves. So to my mind, when I say the Great Pyramid is a shell, it is very clearly a machine of some sort, but we don't really know what kind of machine because there are clearly things missing from it. It's the shell of a machine.
Yes, and the outer coating.
Right.
At one time,
the casing stones.
Yeah, the
and
Arabs at some point
yes.
Removed all that.
Right.
Yeah.
And, this is the other thing. We are looking at the shell of the structure. There are very, very few of those casing stones right at the very base of the Great Pyramid that are still left. And it's on the basis of those that various authors, back to the time of Piazzi Smythe and William Petrie in the 19th century, made the observation that they were fitted so closely together that you could not slide a piece of paper in between the stones. And again, this is an optical precision that we're dealing with here, and the idea of achieving optical precision in the alignment of the structure, in the placement of the stones, by using sleds, ropes, ramps, pulleys, diorite balls, and copper saws, and all the nonsense that has been proffered by Egyptologists over the years, is absolutely ludicrous. It makes no engineering sense whatsoever.
I want to back up a minute.
Sure.
With an electromagnetic field, Joseph, if you wear certain kinds of clothing,
right,
then that field can entrain on you, can it not?
Yes.
Okay. Remember in the Old Testament where the people were told about clothing rules?
Right.
I think that had something to do with that.
It may have. And since you bring that subject up, in the Sumerian text, the Enuma Elish, which is considered by many to be a creation epic, I think it's more of a war epic, there is reference made to Marduk, who is given a garment, and he says a certain word, and he and the garment vanish. And then he says another word, and I reproduce this text in the Giza Death Star Destroyed. And then he says another word, and the garment reappears. So again, we're dealing with clothing. And then, of course, in the Old Testament, we have Joseph and the coat of many colors. Well, what does this mean? That it used a lot of dye?
I don't think so.
I'm increasingly of the opinion that we're looking at residues of a technology that people are trying to explain in the only and best way that they know how.
I agree. Fully. I agree. It would be very hard to, it would be like me trying to explain the physics behind going into outer space. I couldn't do it properly.
Yeah, well, and I should stress something here, GeorgeAnn. When I go back and look at these texts and try to examine them for their possible physics content, I'm speculating too, and speculating on the basis of the best that I can find, the best parallel that I can find in terms of modern scientific papers or theory. But it is clear to me that even with the advanced state of our science and being able to find some amazing and detailed connections, that nonetheless we are still missing something.
Yes.
And that to me tells me that the science, whatever it was that underlay these texts, that science was much more sophisticated even than we can imagine. And that's why, in a certain sense, any of these alternative explanations, whether it be Chris Dunn's power plant hypothesis of the Great Pyramid or my weapon hypothesis of the Great Pyramid, we have to be very frank and honest and tell people that these hypotheses are open-ended. In other words, they're subject to a great deal of modification. They may ultimately be rejected because we may find data down the line from ancient texts or conversely from modern scientific developments that would overturn them. But in either case, we're still dealing with some sort of technology, and that's my point.
Well, is this what you would call archaeology of mass destruction?
Yes, I would. Absolutely, and that's a very apt phrase. Because, you know, to me, GeorgeAnn, it's very strange that there have been such a host of oddball characters associated with the Great Pyramid, and I mention these characters in the books. One of them is a fellow by the name of Farrell, who is an Egyptian planetary geologist who, if you read Richard Hoagland's new book, Dark Mission, and I've got to say I've read it twice since I've had it. You know? Oh yeah, it's one of those page turners, you know.
I'm glad he got that out.
Oh, I am too. I am too.
Bless his heart.
Yeah, but one of the things, you know, that he mentions, that just, you know, I had known about Farrell for some time, but he mentioned something that just threw me for a loop. Because he mentions that he had a background. His father was a very well-known Egyptian esotericist.
Yeah.
And Farrell, of course, became a major planetary geologist for NASA during the Apollo mission. In fact, Farrell had a major hand in assigning the landing sites for the Apollo missions. So, you know, he's no fly-by-night, you know. But one of the most interesting things that I uncovered about the man, and I mentioned this in the Giza Death Star books, is after Apollo, what do we have him doing? Well, we have him taking cosmic ray surveys on the inside of the second big pyramid there at Giza and on the inside of the Great Pyramid. And then when they run the data through the computers at the University of Cairo, one of his Egyptian colleagues came out and gave a press conference, and he was just totally mystified because every time they ran the data, they came up with something completely different.
My goodness.
Oh, yeah. You know, now explain that. So, you know, this Elbaz character is involved in some very interesting things. And then, of course, you have the peculiar behavior of the Egyptian government deciding all of a sudden that they're going to build a wall around the complex. And I've even heard people say, well, it's to protect the site from terrorists and vandals. Well, you know, GeorgeAnn, we're dealing with hardened structures, and I mean that in the military sense. They have withstood earthquakes for thousands of years. So there's not going to be much that a fertilizer bomb in a car or anything else of that nature
or a guy with a machete
is going to be able to do to those things. So, you know, I think the Egyptian government has something else that they're really protecting from and trying to keep people out. And again, I think it's technological in nature, and I think ultimately, you know, behind the smoke screen of Egyptology, they know good and well what they have in their hands, and they're looking for more.
Somebody knows.
Yes, exactly. You know, and this whole technology angle to these ancient ziggurats and pyramids puts kind of an interesting spin on the American presence in Iraq, and then prior to that, the Germans and the French being there. You know, it's as if everybody's digging for something. So I think, yes, your archaeology of mass destruction is probably a very apt phrase. I didn't mean to give you the chills there.
Yeah. Is there a connection with this technology between the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid?
That is a really good one. In the Giza Death Star Destroyed, I point out that one of the most eerie, at least it was to me, and I put it in the book simply so that the readers could see this, because when I first read this and saw it, I was just sort of, again, thrown for a loop. If we look at the face on Mars, the Cydonia face, and we look at it in computer rectification in a profile view, Dr. Mark Carlotto, one of Richard Hoagland's early associates, did this. If we look at it in that profile, it bears an uncanny resemblance to the friezes and pictures of the Babylonian god Nergal.
Yeah.
And I reproduced these seals and friezes in the Giza Death Star destroyed, along with that profile view of the face on Mars, and I think you know what I'm talking about. And it's just eerily similar. It's one of those things that's not sufficient data or evidence to say anything conclusive. But if it's a coincidence, it's sure one that raises the eyebrows.
Well, it's that as above, so below kind of thing.
Yes, it's another one of those, precisely, as above, so below. And, you know, it's interesting because Nergal, in turn, is the Sumerian god of war, rebellion, and fire, and Mars. So, in other words, the association is there. And another thing about Nergal that I should mention, he's a chimerical character in these Babylonian friezes. He's kind of a Sagittarius type appearing creature.
Hybrid.
Yeah, a hybrid. And again, we're dealing with something very similar in the Sphinx. And many people have pointed out that the Sphinx is kind of oddly proportioned, and they speculate that since the head of the Sphinx is so much smaller by proportion than the body, that it may have been recarved from something else at some date. Well, since no one has ever made a really convincing case that the face on the Sphinx is the face of a pharaoh, Khufu, that supposedly built the thing and then restored it, I speculate that maybe there was another face on it, and that it was recarved to memorialize whoever took possession of the compound as a result of this war, and that it may tie in somehow to the Babylonian god Nergal. So there's just all sorts of these little speculative connections that I explore in these books.
Well, that is a good point that about could have been recarved. Very good point.
Well, it's a point I think, it doesn't get mentioned much lately,
right.
But it is a point. If you go back to the work of John Anthony West and Robert Schock, who did such amazing work with the dating of the Sphinx based on geology, and I think their work was actually in a special that Mysteries of the Sphinx, I think it was put on TV with Charlton Heston hosting a couple years ago, 2-hour well, it would have been about 5 years ago, 2-hour special. They go into this recarving theory at some length. They haul in one of the New York City Police Department's best forensic face reconstructors. And he does, on this show, a very amazing analysis of the face on the Sphinx versus the face on one of these little statues in the Cairo Museum that Egyptologists claim is the face on the Sphinx. And there's just no similarity of facial proportion or structure between the two at all. So, as far as I'm concerned, the recarving case has been made. The very early dating case for the Sphinx has been made. I don't think it's a structure that was built by Egyptians in the 4th Dynasty and so on and so forth.
No. Okay. Joseph, what about the pyramid text and Cyrus?
Well, the pyramid text, one of the interesting things that I keep bumping into, and maybe this can be taken as kind of a generalized comment on some alternative researchers. Graham Hancock and Robert Boval and Adrian, I forget what his last name is, Adrian something or other, have referred to, as many other authors have, the pyramid text in relationship to Giza, and they're trying to figure out what the purpose of the compound was. And in the very texts, particularly that Graham Hancock cites, I keep noticing these military allusions. Giza is referred to, and I put this in the Giza Death Star, Giza is referred to as the royal fortress and things of this nature. And they skim right by these types of military references. And I ran into the same thing again when I was writing Cosmic War. It's almost as if some alternative researchers don't want to face the more unpleasant aspects of these texts, that there was weaponry involved, that there was a war that was involved, and so on and so forth. But it's very clear in the texts themselves. And in one of the most interesting things, Andrew Collins, I believe it's when the book When the Gods Came Down, Andrew Collins makes a very interesting and very provocative case that when one encounters the term Rostau in Egyptian texts, that refers precisely to Giza. And he points out that its associations, the context in which it occurs in some of these Egyptian texts, is totally military. So this kind of ties in with my idea that I explore a little bit in the Giza Death Star Deployed and then the Giza Death Star Destroyed, that I think we're looking at, when we look at Giza, we're definitely looking at the compound as a whole having been set out on a prearranged, very clear geometric plan. And in fact, I reproduced this plan in the Giza Death Star Deployed. Because if we take an aerial view of the compound, if we put the Great Pyramid exactly in the center, if we run an axis of rotation down through the Great Pyramid from its apex to the base, rotate it through 120 degrees, and take kind of a snapshot, and use kind of an plastic overlay, and then rotate it another 120 degrees. So we've rotated it now, the whole compound, through 240 degrees. Take another snapshot and overlay it. What do we end up with? We end up with the Star of David. Or, as Richard Hoagland would put it, we end up with a two-dimensional representation of two ortho-rotated, spherically circumscribed tetrahedra. Yeah. And I reproduced this diagram in the book. So again, I think all of this physics, all of the textual references that pile up point to, again, some sort of military purpose for the compound. Now, that being said, I think the compound was built in three distinct chronological layers. And I think the Great Pyramid is the oldest of those layers. In other words, if we take Robert Schoch and John Anthony West's hypothesis that the Sphinx is approximately 7,500 to 8,000 years old, or older really, if you include AD years in it, that it goes back to about 8,000 BC, then I believe the Great Pyramid is an older structure.
Yeah.
And then the second layer of construction there would be represented by the Sphinx, the Valley Temples, the second big pyramid there at Giza, and then a third layer of construction representing Menkaure, the third, the smaller of the three great pyramids there, and then all those smaller pyramids and little temples that are surrounding the compound there. And that layer, I think, is the genuinely Egyptian layer. But I think the whole compound was built deliberately, laid out as one grand geometric design from the outset. And again, I don't think that design comes from the Egyptians. No.
Well, what about the ancient Hebrews and their knowledge of geometry?
Well, again, I don't think they're either. And I realize that places me in opposition to a lot of favored alternative researchers.
But Joseph, what were they doing in the Fayum?
Pardon me?
You know, the Hebrews, when they were in the Fayum in Egypt, in this captivity thing.
Well, again, the captivity, I think, occurs much too late. In the game for what I'm talking about. You know, if the Sphinx is 8,000 BC and the Great Pyramid is older, the captivity, you know, the Exodus, depending on when you date it, is about 1440 to 1250 BC. So the captivity is at a much, much later period. However, the in other words, the point is they would not have been involved in any of the construction of these things that I'm talking about.
Okay.
But let's recall where the Hebrews come from ultimately.
Yes.
Sumer.
Yes.
So in other words, we have these two great legacy civilizations. We have Sumer, we have Egypt. We have, in both of those civilizations, clear textual indications of a war, of a sophisticated technology, of a sophisticated physics, and so on and so forth. And between those two poles, the Hebrews are constantly moving. So I think, just to kind of give a very generalized answer to your question, I think that we have to consider the possibility that the Old Testament preserves, for whatever reason, a unique perspective on those two civilizations and their technologies. It's as if they were intentionally supposed to partake of both civilizations and both worlds and understand something about them. Now, I haven't, and I put it that generally because I'm well aware, since my academic background is in theology, I'm well aware of the implications of what I'm saying for standard Christian doctrine and standard Christian history. And I should make one thing perfectly clear when I say that. I am not at all sympathetic in any way to the modern American civil religion, its revivalist religion, to evangelicalism of any sort. I come from a very sacramental, very ritualistic, liturgical tradition that is very old, so I don't want people to misunderstand where I'm coming from. But, that being said, I'm very familiar with the theological implications of what I've been saying and writing about in my books, but I haven't addressed them directly. And the reason why is that there are so very many detailed implications to be considered very carefully from the standpoint of what the early Christians understood about scriptures, from the standpoint of what they understood about heresies, from the standpoint of what they understood about angels. And it's very interesting that the early Christian writers and church fathers had no difficulty, really, in believing in the existence of giants and extraterrestrials meddling in human affairs. It's really a more modern prejudice that we encounter that.
Right.
But for that very reason, then, these implications have to be considered very carefully, very thoroughly, and in a very scholarly manner. And we really can't even begin to do that until we lay the groundwork of what these other civilizations are saying and telling us about that physics and technology.
Well, Joseph, you've really hit the nail on the head with what you've said, because there is so much that has been hidden from the Christians, from the whole of the human race.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's not just hidden from Christians. I mean, it's hidden from everybody.
Oh yes, I agree. And in a certain sense, I think most of the hiding has been in the open.
Yeah.
These texts have always been there, and to a certain extent in the 20th century and to some cases in the 19th, they've been more or less available to the public. But it's very interesting because by dint of the academic hold on those texts, a certain kind of interpretation has always been encouraged about them, namely that they had to be read as mythological texts, or they had to be read as scientific as metaphysical texts. And one of the things that really set me off in examining the texts for their potential science, for their potential physics, was precisely a comment that I had read in conjunction with this type of metaphysical thinking in some of the Greek church fathers, when they would say things about the Neoplatonists, for example, that in their words, they were really not talking about metaphysics at all. They were talking about sensory things, and that just brought me up short, because what that meant was, as far as the Greek church fathers were concerned, these texts were really talking about nothing more than physics.
Yes.
And when I, and I got to tell you, that's a shocker.
Sure.
Because no one had really considered the full implications of what those church fathers actually had said.
Right.
Because, by academic training, we're all sitting around scratching our heads and trying to figure out, well, is this an Aristotelian essence or a Stoic one, or, and yada, yada, yada. When, in fact, they're telling us exactly the way they're reading the text and what they're seeing there. And that's precisely what really set me out to look at those texts again to see if I could find a formally explicit and notatable topological, mathematical, and physical metaphor in those texts, and lo and behold, it popped out in full glory once I did.
Well, going back into the pyramid thing, the king's chamber,
right.
the queen's chamber, and we have this interconnectedness theory,
right.
Non-locality, getting intertwined with that.
Well, this opens up a whole new avenue of speculation, and I kind of outline it a bit in the 3 books. And that is, if we look at the pyramid itself, if we can imagine for the moment the Great Pyramid having all of its immaculately polished, closely fitted white casing stones on it again. If we can imagine it as having that golden or quartz or whatever sort of capstone existed on the top of it at one point, then the first thing, speaking in purely physics terms now, the first thing about the structure that we notice is that it is bright and visible for tens of miles in the surrounding countryside. Even Herodotus comments on this fact, that you can see this structure from miles and miles away. It is so huge and so bright. But from an even deeper physics perspective, this thing is hardly going to paint a radar stealth signature. That's putting it rather crudely, but that's about the best way to put it. Is this going to be there? If you're bouncing radar beams off of it, it's going to collect and absorb microwave radiation to a tremendous degree. And in fact, I mentioned this in the Giza Death Star series, that the faces on the Great Pyramid are unique of all pyramidal structures that we know of anywhere, in that they are parabolic. They are collectors. So again, you see, we're dealing with an extraordinary degree of engineering, and you certainly don't need parabolic faces, once again, to bury an Egyptian pharaoh. There's a degree of engineering here that's just utterly absurd if you stop and think about what the Egyptologists are saying. But anyway, in dealing with the chambers now, if we look at this structure as it was originally built, what we're seeing is a gigantic crystal. The whole structure is one huge crystal. And it's made out of stones, limestone and granite, which are in turn, what? Crystal. Particularly granite. Granite has nothing but tiny little quartz crystals embedded all throughout it.
And it does have an EM field.
And it does have an EM field. It's piezoelectrics. So again, it's a huge crystal. Now, if we stop and look at what crystals are, crystals have what's called a lattice structure, a grid of nodal points. And if we look at crystals, we always see defects. There are little displacements in that lattice structure. There are twist-type defects where there's a kind of a screw displacement. There are displacements where part of the lattice is simply missing and the crystal has collapsed into each other. And interestingly enough, you can describe such displacements in the lattice structure of a crystal precisely by using, hang on now, the torsion tensor from tensor calculus. Oh my, yes. So in other words, if you take a naturally grown crystal, my idea is that it is a crystal that has grown in response to very minute little fluctuations in the local space-time field and the little torsion displacements in it. Okay? With me so far?
Yes.
All right. Now, once we grasp that idea, then we go on to the Great Pyramid as a gigantic crystal. And I suggest this. I don't do much with it. I just toss it out there for people to think about, But if we look at the interior structure of the Great Pyramid with those empty chambers, I'm going to wager you, I will put it right here on your show, I'm going to wager you that once enough physics is known about the structure, we will discover that the empty spaces that constitute the internal chambers of the Great Pyramid represent lattice displacements in that crystal.
Oh, my goodness.
And that they are there in their position for precisely a functional purpose having to do with torsion and therefore with the manipulation of the fabric of local space-time.
Oh, my gosh.
That was just in a little footnote.
Yeah, well, hey,
that's a deep footnote.
That's a pretty heavy one. Whoa. Well, okay, when we talk about that and, manipulating the fabric of space and time, okay, what is real, Joseph, and what is real to us?
Okay, you mentioned non-locality and reality earlier when you asked this question. And this is kind of what I'm getting up to here.
I'm aching to know. Believe me.
Well, there is in physics a theorem that's called Bell's non-locality theorem. And let me see if I can kind of put this in blunt terms. Okay. In that theorem, what we would see as our everyday world, or more particularly, what we would see at the level of the subatomic particle, is really a world in which a particle's location really isn't in view. A particle's location is an effect, so to speak, of a deeper reality that is completely non-local in nature. And this is why you can have phenomena in quantum mechanics, at least on this type of thinking, of photon entanglement, where you can entangle information in two photons, send them out at great distances from each other, and then alter the information in one, which will automatically appear in the other photon, which will take on the same altered characteristic. And that information transfer will happen at faster than light velocity. So in other words, in terms of quantum mechanics, the underlying information transfer somehow has to depend on some underlying higher dimensional non-local medium. And that, I think, is what ultimately is at stake in the Great Pyramid. That's why that baffling internal array of structures, I think, will ultimately be shown to involve some sort of deliberate lattice displacement to manipulate a torsion effect, and to do so and be able to do so in a non-local manner. Okay,
could we examine this from this angle also? In the pseudepigrapha, and I believe also in the book of Isaiah, I'm not sure, but I think it's also found there, that God made what we see out of the unseen.
Oh, yes, absolutely. This is actually the best scriptural verse, and of course I come from a tradition where what the Protestants call the Apocrypha is considered part of the canon. In the second book of Maccabees, there is perhaps the best verse that one would encounter for the idea of a creation out of nothing, or ex nihilo. In the Greek, it's ek nu onton, which means literally out of that which is not, or that which has no being. Now, I mention this because in that topological metaphor that I explore in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, one of the interesting things that emerges from it is that in most of the ancient Hermetic texts, they start from a very similar nothing. And let's look at what a nothing is in terms of physics.
Okay.
In terms of physics, a nothing is simply not observable. In other words, if you have everywhere existing nothing but an ultimate sameness, so to speak, you have quite literally a nothing, because there's no differentiation upon which to make any observation whatsoever. So once you, so to speak, thump that nothing, let's just use that crude metaphor. I call it the big thump theory.
Okay.
Let's take our, let's just say that we metaphorically, so to speak, take our finger and thump it. Okay? That thump of that, whatever that nothing is, whatever that through and through sameness is, will produce a differentiation. As a result of that differentiation, you can observe it. And once that differentiation sort of crashes into, so to speak, the other parts of this sameness, more and more differentiation results. In other words, this whole system, in the ancient view of it, creates information. And once we've said that, we're right back at non-locality, because the principal point of Bell's non-locality theorem was to explain why and how information transfer occurs between quantum particles at seemingly faster than light speeds, which relativity had prohibited. So in other words, all of this is dovetailing back together again. And this topological metaphor, I think, is that I found in these texts was really one of the most breathtaking things that I did find. It really caught me quite off guard, to be honest with you. But it's the materia prima that some ancient esotericists talk about, or the first matter, or if one prefer the term the ether, or whatever one describes this is in a certain sense very similar to, at least from the physics point of view, is very similar to this nothingness that has been so much a part of Jewish and Christian and Muslim philosophy.
Well, out of which, like transmutative matter?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's a transmutative ether. It's a transmutative materia prima.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, in Egyptian thinking, one of the precise ways that the natures, or which is what is usually transferred as gods in the Egyptian texts, one of the ways in which they are distinguished is precisely by what a mathematician would call their topological descent from that initial sameness. So in other words, it's all information-based and information-related, which, to me, again, this is, GeorgeAnn, an extraordinarily sophisticated view in terms of modern physics.
Oh, my goodness, yes. You're not kidding.
Yeah, it's just absolutely breathtaking when you view it in that light.
Yes. And, when we view it that way, too, and we go back through the ancient texts, including the scriptures,
right?
We find these little jewels.
Yes.
That if a person's mind is looking for it, they're going to see it.
Oh yes.
And pick up on it, and you just sit there with your mouth open, like, oh my gosh.
Right.
I mean, it's huge.
Right. It is very, very huge, and this points out one of those theological difficulties I mentioned earlier, and we might as well mention it now. In the standard academic approach to these things, if we look, for example, at Plato's idea of a demiurge sort of coming along and finding some stuff and fashioning it into the world, well, if you look at standard Christian apologetics through the centuries, that view has always been challenged because, of course, on that very simplistic basis, Plato's demiurge is not the equivalent of the biblical creator God. In other words, he's not almighty. He's taking an existing thing that's there. But if we plug this kind of rather different approach to whatever this materia prima may have been, it is a genuine nothing. Because, again, existence itself depends on differentiation. And in order to differentiate this all throughout sameness or nothingness, you would have to indeed be, number one, intelligent, and number two, you would have to have power over it. You would have to transcend it in order to set all of this process in motion. So in a peculiar way, this type of thinking harmonizes rather than opposes a lot of these ancient views. Plato's demiurge may not be quite what we have been told to think it was, and by the same token, the whole idea of creation ex nihilo may mean something with much profounder links to science than we also have been led to believe it did. So again, this is kind of speculating off the top of my head, but it gives you kind of an idea of the types of theological issues that are probably going to be addressed over the next 100 to 200 years in a massive attempt to exhibit where these details concur with classical doctrines and where they don't. I think we're just on the cusp of something very new and exciting, not only scientifically, but in terms of traditional theological thinking. And I should make another point very clear. I do not believe, it is not my impression from having done this research over the last 7 years with all these books, it is not my impression that any of this fundamentally challenges or destroys any of those doctrines, but it does challenge what has been assumed to be their classical implications in some respects. In other words, their entailments.
Yeah. Well, in some of this that you've just gone through, I get an idea. And I've never said it out loud to anybody.
Me too. Yeah, I do.
And some guy in China comes up with the same idea.
Yeah, I know. It's very frustrating, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, we can't shut up our mind.
No, that's true.
Okay, there's this interconnectedness. Okay. How is this happening, Joseph? I mean, is all the energy of human thought caught in this loop? Constrained in this loop?
Oh, boy.
And when we can jump out of that loop, we can really do some things,
Yeah, I understand.
How does this, theoretically, how does this operate?
One of the things that emerged from this topological metaphor that I began to explore in the Giza Death Star Deployed and then really just let it out there in the third book, the Giza Death Star Destroyed, one of the things that is a clear implication is that if we're dealing in those texts, as I believe we are in some cases, with a formally explicit topological and physics metaphor that is capable of being cast into the symbolic language of topology, and I attempt to demonstrate that in the book, that it can be. One of the things that this inevitably implies is that with the creation of information, we are dealing, therefore, in this metaphor at the get-go, at the outset. There is no way to avoid it. With intelligence,
it's in the ether.
It's in the ether, so to speak.
Okay.
And therefore, with intelligences, and that this stuff, once the technique, once the basic metaphor is understood, it has then the potential also to exhibit itself as a technique for the manipulation of consciousness. And that is another one of these very, very disturbing potentials that this stuff has. Because if this is correct, then that metaphor, that very formal mathematics that I attempt to kind of outline, and trust me, I only outline it in the books. I've gotten private notebooks full of this stuff that I'll probably burn when I die. But if this is the case, then what we're really looking at is the formally explicit basis for what subsequently becomes the much watered down, much declined legacy of the manipulation of will and consciousness that we call ceremonial magic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you see why I was reluctant to put everything in the Giza Death Star destroyed.
Well, you're right, because, I've done a lot of work with David Seeloff, and he has constantly maintained that the pagans engaged in these magical rites because they worked.
Right.
See, but that the Israelite people were forbidden to engage in those things. There was a line drawn there. But he said, those things worked. They produced results.
They did, and they do. And we have to go back and again, I think, very carefully examine some of the texts of the Old Testament.
Oh, yes.
Particularly, in episodes like Moses and the confrontation with the Egyptian priests, or Elijah and the confrontation with the priests of Baal, and so on and so forth. But particularly Moses, because, of course, Moses, or Moshe, is not a Hebrew name. It's Egyptian. Thutmose, the Egyptian pharaoh, has the same part of the name in his name.
Yeah.
So, it is extraordinarily likely, given his position within the Egyptian royal houses, that Moses was an initiate into precisely some of these practices and knew them well. So the prohibitions that we find in the Old Testament, again, I think we have to look at very carefully, because it is clear, to my mind anyway, that some of this stuff is being used by the Hebrews. So exactly what is it that they are allowed to do and why, and exactly what is it that they are not allowed to do and why not?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, and I don't think that we are at the stage, if any of this sort of paleophysical analysis holds up, I don't think we're at the stage that we can answer that question yet, and this is why I've been very reluctant in all of my books to address any of these issues directly. I allude to them certainly in the Giza Death Star series, as you well know, and I, moreover, allude to them very clearly in the Cosmic War. But I think they have to be approached extraordinarily carefully, because there is so much at stake, not only in terms of general culture and general science, but more particularly for Christian religion and doctrine.
Well, with going back to the pyramid, the capstone,
right?
It would seem reasonable that capstone may have been made out of minerals.
Minerals, and in the I believe Herodotus mentioned, but don't cite me on that. I'm going off of groggy memory here. I've been doing emails hot and heavy, as you know, from our discussion before the show. But I think it was he that mentioned that the capstone was gold, and of course there is the case of another capstone, a pyramidion, or sometimes called in Egypt in the Cairo Museum, that's also made of pure gold. But given the pyramids, the Great Pyramid's unique angle, the steep 51-degree, 51 minutes, so many odd seconds, I think it's 14 seconds slope that the pyramid has. This is exactly the angle, 51 degrees, is exactly the natural angle of quartz. If you look at the pointed tips of quartzes, that'll be about a 51-degree angle. So I've always kind of held open the possibility, especially given what I think the pyramid may have been, that capstone, or at least a great portion of it, may have been made out of quartz, since that's the natural angle that it forms in, and it would have been more or less easy to machine something, of course, a very large quartz in that case. But again, the minerals idea, to me, points out that the ancient science was sophisticated enough that they knew something about materials science and minerals that we yet don't know.
That we don't understand.
Or that we don't understand. It may be staring us in the face, as so many of these things often are, and we just haven't thought about the obvious yet. And, again, that's another good question that you mentioned, because again and again I run into, in these texts, very clear references to known minerals, but they're references that are made in such a way that you just feel, and I think you'll recall these passages from the Cosmic War and the inventory of the stones that I reproduce in there. They just feel more technologically based than what the texts are actually able to translate. There's something that we're missing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure that it's going to be made plain at some point.
Yes, I think so.
What about this luminiferous ether?
Okay, that was a term that was given in the 19th century by physicists to what they understood this underlying medium or materia prima to be. And literally, it simply means the ether. The term ether itself is, it's just a fancy Latin word, and all it means, quite literally, is stuff.
Yeah.
and lumen, of course, is light, and then and ferrous would be the bearing of light. So it's light-bearing stuff.
Yeah.
And the reason they came up with this term, of course, is because in the thinking at that time, any wave that was known to physical mechanics had to have some medium of propagation. And that meant that electromagnetic waves that were traveling through space had to have, in their thinking, some sort of medium upon which to wave, so to speak. And that's the term they came up with. And what they meant by it was simply an ultra-fine matter.
Okay.
A superfine matter, as a matter of fact. And that in turn led, of course, to one of the most famous experiments in physics that took place in the late 19th century, the so-called Michelson-Morley experiment. Because they reasoned that if there was this ether and the Earth was traveling along through it, if they shined a beam of light in the direction of the Earth's travel along this path through the ether, and then shined a beam perpendicular to it, and then interfered those beams again on a plate, if they detected a phase interference grating, okay, in other words, if we toss two stones into a pond, they're going to make interfering ripples on the surface of the pond. If they detected a pattern of interference like that, that meant that the light beam that's traveling along with the Earth and the light beam traveling perpendicular to it are traveling at different speeds. This was their way to detect the existence of that ether.
Okay.
When no interference pattern was detected, they had a big oops. Because, of course, the whole point of the experiment was to prove the ether, and when there wasn't this pattern that should have resulted from that theory, they were left, so to speak, scratching their heads. Well, we know what happened as a result of that experiment eventually. Einstein came along and formulated the special theory of relativity, in which he said that the results of the experiment are explainable on the basis of the velocity of light being constant in any direction to any frame of reference. Okay? That's where all of that originated.
Well, now, didn't SRI come out here, was it the late 90s or early 2000s, something like that?
Uh-huh.
Said that the speed of light actually fluctuates?
Oh, yes. This is another aspect of the story that kind of got shuffled to the sidelines. Well, not kind of, it did in a big way. Because many people pointed out, particularly right around the turn of the century, that the two American physicists that had set up the Michelson-Morley experiment had done so in the wrong way. In other words, they were measuring the wrong thing in the wrong way at the wrong place. And one of these physicists was a French physicist by the name of Georges Sagnac, who said, well, all of this would be fine and dandy if space were nice and neat and rectilinear, like your experiment assumes it to be. But space isn't like that. Space rotates. The Earth rotates. Everything in space rotates. And the things that are rotating, in turn, revolve around other rotating things. So we're not dealing with a nice kind of boxy space. Everything's curved. And of course that was one of the great insights of Einstein as well. But Sagnac did an interesting thing. He reperformed the experiment, only this time he said in order for us to reproduce these conditions, we have to rotate the system of these two split light beams. So he set up a little ring of mirrors and so on basically nothing but a big phonograph plate. And he shot a beam of light in the direction of the rotation of the phonograph plate, and another one that was split from that beam against the direction of rotation, and then interfered that split beam back on a pattern or on a projection so that he could see if an interference pattern resulted. And of course it did. So, this experiment he performed in 1913, which was 8 years after Einstein's special relativity paper in 1905, and 3 years before Einstein's general relativity paper in 1916. So, in other words, Sagnac basically proved that there is some sort of drag effect, there is some sort of ether, but it is only detectable rotating it. And of course, by that time, everybody had just sort of jumped on the Einstein bandwagon, and as a result of that, when they looked at Sagnac's experiment, they attempted to explain its results in terms of relativity, when, of course, Sagnac was really trying to redo Michelson-Morley in a proper way. So, this is another case where the history of physics is so fascinating because you can see at work the presuppositions that people bring to data and to the interpretation of data.
Wow. Well, okay, we've talked about the crystals. If you were to live in an area where there are huge mines of crystals buried deep, in the earth.
Right.
Not all that deep down now. You can build your house right on top of one of these things.
Right.
Would it be possible for that kind of an area, Joseph, to affect the thinking of the people that live there?
I don't honestly know, but on the basis of
theoretically,
just wild, and I stress wildly speculating here. If what we've said about crystals being little natural resonators to little local variations, torsion-type variations, then it is possible, if you have enough of them sort of piled up together in one location, like maybe the Great Pyramid, that you're dealing with something that may affect emotional states in ways that we don't know. Now, having mentioned that, one of the interesting things that I have heard in response to my whole weapon hypothesis for the Great Pyramid was at a conference with a fairly well-known other alternative pyramid researcher. And he suggested to the audience, after I was done with my talk and he was giving his, that if the pyramid was a weapon, maybe it was a weapon beaming feelings of love, harmony, joy, and peace. Okay?
Where is that at?
Okay, well, hang on.
Okay.
Hang on. Now, I didn't respond at the time because, in the situation it really wasn't appropriate. But I do mention this in this episode in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, the third of the pyramid books. And one of the interesting speculations that I entertain as a result of this line of thinking that you're suggesting is that if one looks at the history of that region, it doesn't appear to be at all one of beaming love, harmony, joy, and peace.
Right.
It's a region drenched in blood.
Yes.
It is a region that has, for any untold thousands of years, had revelations of one sort or another and foundings of religions and mystery schools, and they're all fighting each other.
Yes.
So, if any of that is true, then maybe, and this is the real point of the speculation I made in the book, maybe the Great Pyramid, the shell of that ancient weapon that is still there, is still somehow functioning.
Oh my.
And we don't know it.
You mean like a residue of it?
Like a residue. That it is perhaps affecting consciousness in the region. And for that matter, if we're going to extend the theory and again, wildly speculate, maybe the same holds true of all of those pyramidal structures that we find in the world. I don't know. But, it is an interesting thing to entertain the possibility. Maybe there's a technology working behind all these channeled messages from ET of love, joy, and peace, or, messages of blessings and benevolence from the sun god Ra and all the nonsense that you find.
Right.
Maybe, and I don't discount those things. I'm not saying that they don't happen, that they don't exist. But maybe we're looking, to supernatural and paranormal explanations for these things when we, in fact, should be looking for something technological that has been here all along right under our noses, and we just don't understand it yet. That to me would be the real implication of this line of speculation.
Well, that's a pretty heavy thought.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Well, Joseph, what, in the terms of the way we think as human beings, and we think of boundaries and things like that, there is something in Scripture that says, a gulf was created between us and them, or which I would interpret that as a boundary. Okay, a boundary between our world, whatever it is. I mean, if it's real, is it the real reality, or is it a shadow of the reality? The boundary between our world and what?
Well, again, if we kind of speculate on the paleophysics model that we've been using in these talks, and look at that question, what I would answer, not discounting or discarding the spiritual aspect in any way, but to look at the physics manifestation of it, it would then seem to be some sort of boundary condition between two different types of spaces. If we can imagine for a moment say, for example, the surface of a cube, that two-dimensional surface is part of a three-dimensional object. So in other words, in a certain sense, it touches a higher dimensional thing. It's a part of it. In the same way, we can envision a surface touching a hypercube, in other words, a cube existing in 4 or more dimensions. So again, we're dealing with a kind of a boundary condition. So I think if we extend this line of speculation, there may be, again, something, and I stress may be, something physical to expressions like that. And hence, one would expect that insofar as it is physical, one might be able to open some sort of gateway to whatever it is that is beyond that boundary, provided one had the technology and the physics and mathematics to do it. And again, this is what I think you see clearly in some of these ancient texts, and I think it may be part of a covert agenda at play in that region of the world, and the interest in the major powers of the world in it.
Wow. Yeah. Well, weren't they trying to do something like that at Montauk?
Well, I mentioned Montauk. I must be honest. I mentioned Montauk in the Giza Death Star, the very first of the Pyramid books, but only insofar as to bring out a certain idea that was brought out in connection with Montauk, and namely the idea that time is one of the fundamental elements of this type of physics. As far as the Montauk project itself goes, I've never been a fan of the whole lore and mythology around it. I just don't, how to put it, I just don't see a sufficient basis in good, reliable data for the whole idea of it. To put it bluntly, I'm very suspicious of the whole thing, and I'm very suspicious especially of the attempt that some have made to tie the theory into the Philadelphia experiment. I just, that whole effort and that whole literature that's out there, to be honest with you, just leaves me sort of cold.
Well, with the Philadelphia experiment, is it possible that they, when we go back into, like the pseudepigrapha,
right,
and some of the other texts, we're told that at the end of time, 200, these demonic entities are going to be released unchained from the Euphrates. Now, my question is it possible that long ago, maybe pre-flood, probably pre-flood, people were messing around with this stuff and got trapped in I don't know what to call it, a dimension or...
kind of a dimensional loop?
Yeah, and they can't get out. And they are not human like we are. They're not, at least the way the text described them. Is it possible that at some point that loop will be opened technologically and they're freed?
Well, yeah, I think on the basis of everything that we've speculated thus far, we would have to say yes.
I'm gritting my teeth while I'm
yes. Well, and moreover, again, to put it in the perspective of some of these ancient texts when they're talking about the gates of the gods or the dwellings of the gods or doors of the gods, whatever particular metaphor one encounters. Again, if everything else that we have said about a paleophysical interpretation of the details of those texts is true, then we have to entertain the idea that those are not just metaphors, that they are trying to describe a technology. And once we entertain that possibility, then we certainly have to entertain the possibility that something like that may have happened. And again, I wouldn't even be inclined to discount it or to denigrate the idea any great degree, because again, this is one of those things that inevitably pops out of the text when you start looking at them in this fashion. So I would have to say, as a speculative possibility, definitely yes, that this might be what's in play. And that's kind of scary.
Yeah, it is. And especially when we're looking at people being able to manipulate the fabric of time and space with technological weapons and things like that.
Right.
Oh my gosh. Okay, what about time travel?
Well, again, once we start entertaining these possibilities, you certainly can't close the door to it. However, just on the basis of the types of even extrapolating from some of these theoretical physics papers that I refer to in the books, when we look at them, there is inevitably some ability to manipulate time. But whether or not that ability includes the ability to travel in time is a very different thing. It's not clear if that would be possible. having said that, I'll let a little tidbit out from the new book. That's about the Philadelphia experiment. If we go back and look at the torsion tensor that Einstein used in his 1928 unified field theory paper, one of the possibilities that might emerge, and I'm stressing these words very carefully because I don't want people to go off in a new age hot flash and say, well, Farrell said time travel is possible, and that, I just don't want that to happen. But one of the things that emerges that might be possible from a consideration of torsion is that some sort of time travel or displacement would be a better word along an object's axis of time might be possible under certain conditions, and moreover might be possible without the wormhole constrictions that other people theorize as a basis for time travel. And what do I mean by that? In wormhole thinking, people that extrapolate about the possibilities of using wormholes for some sort of time travel. Well, the nasty difficulty about wormholes is that they are incredibly tiny. They are so tiny, in fact, that they're on the order of the Planck length, which, if you know anything about the Planck length, it's just super billions of times smaller than tiny. So any idea of a normal physical being, so to speak, squeezing themselves through one of those things, if I can just be very crude about it, is just kind of nuts. But there are some indications that torsion may be able to accomplish, and again, I'm stressing awfully heavily here the word may be able to accomplish some sort of displacement on the time axis of an object without having to invoke those incredibly horrid constraints that wormholes invoke. Now, the reason I'm stressing all of this, GeorgeAnn, is very important.
Yeah.
Because wormholes and that whole line of thinking are an implication or an artifact of the kind of physics that one develops if one is still thinking or basing oneself in terms of general relativity. All of this stuff that you hear, dark matter, wormholes, dark energy, and so on ad infinitum, are implications that have fallen out, so to speak, and I'm going to use a difficult word here, and I hope people will understand it in its proper sense, that have fallen out from the doctrine of relativity. Okay?
Okay.
Torsion, on the other hand, is coming out of a very different theory that Einstein developed after general relativity due to his own dissatisfactions with it. So in other words, I want to emphasize that we're dealing, in a certain sense, with a very different kind of physics already with Einstein's 1928 unified field theory paper. And again, I'm stressing something else about it. Einstein himself knew when he published that paper that it was an incomplete theory. But, and here's, and I'm not going to say any more of this than this, an incomplete theory does not necessarily mean an unengineerable theory.
Well said.
Aha.
Yeah, well said. Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. This has been.
This has really been a wild one.
Exciting.
Yeah, it has been.
Very exciting, and oh my gosh, Joseph. Your books are they're just filled with, mind-provoking material. I mean, it really makes you think.
Well, thank you.
And I love the fact that you do go back into the old texts, because I think that's where we're going to find a lot of the answers.
Yes, I do too. I agree with you.
And it's just, going to take time. And
yes.
You know, I hope that, I wonder if the answers are, I mean, okay, here we go. Is the answer already out there and it's just hidden? Or, go ahead.
Well, the Cliff Notes answer is yes.
Okay.
And if one follows the research, and I'm going to toss out 3 very different authors in this alternative field.
Okay.
If one follows the research of, say, Richard Hoagland,
very good author,
or myself,
excellent,
or Andrew Collins, you know, just to pick 3 very, very different approaches.
Okay.
If one follows these approaches carefully, then the answers have to, in some respects, lie in artifacts that have yet to be found in those regions of the world. But by the very nature of the case that I've been making in the Giza Death Star series and in the Cosmic War, some of those answers are going to be found on the Moon,
yes,
and on Mars,
yes,
and on other celestial bodies in our local celestial neighborhood. And in this respect, you know, just on the basis of an examination of the texts, nothing else, in this respect, Hoagland has been dead on for years,
yes,
because he has been approaching it from the standpoint of NASA data and so on and so forth that strongly indicate some sort of artifacts, not only on Mars, but on the Moon,
yes,
and so on and so forth. So, you know, and if on the other hand you look at someone like an Andrew Collins, who has also been stressing that there are just too many weird anomalies that are associated with just even recently discovered archaeological digs in Turkey or Mesopotamia and so on and so forth, that indicate something of a very sophisticated nature was occurring a lot earlier than we have been led to believe. Then again, you're looking at the very same areas of the world. So over and over again, we're finding that, you know, if the answer is yes, that we're going to find this stuff if we keep digging quite literally, then yeah, I think we're going to find some of it on Earth, but not all of it.
Well, you know, that makes a lot of sense. You know, they're setting up this global government.
Yeah.
They want to rule, you know, everything and everybody. They've inventoried everything and everybody.
Right.
You know, and it's just interesting that they are doing what the Nazis did.
Yes.
You know, digging.
Yes.
And, I pray to God they don't dig in the right spot.
Well, you know, all the indications are thus far that they have been digging in the right spots.
Yeah.
But one aspect of this technology is that if you don't really have a mastery of it, it can turn around and bite you.
Oh, yes.
And I don't think that these yahoos in their arrogance really have mastered it yet. I think basically we're dealing with blockheads when it comes to this stuff.
They're still running around killing people.
Well, yeah, they're still running around killing people, you know, but ultimately they're blockheads, and
agreed.
They're dependent on people much more intelligent than they, and that may turn around and bite them.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and I can't say it couldn't happen to a more deserving crowd of people.
Amen to that, Joseph. Oh my gosh, you and I are standing on the same soapbox there.
Yeah. The big soapbox.
Oh,
there's lots of people standing on it.
Yeah, we don't feel lonely on that one.
No.
I tell you. Oh, well, everybody, you need to go and get Joseph's books. And you can call, now, Adventures Unlimited Press
right.
has a 24-hour credit card order line. And that number is 815-253-6390. That's 815-253-6390.
There's also a toll-free line, too, if I can give that out, GeorgeAnn.
You betcha.
That's Adventures Unlimited, and it's 1-800-718-4514. And online, it's www.adventuresunlimitedpress. That's all one word, and it's all lowercase. And I should stress that all of the books are $16.95 each, with the exception of the last one, the new one, The Cosmic War, which is $18.95. And there is a 10% discount from the publisher on orders of 3 or more books, and then of course they can get the books at Barnes and Noble or Borders or Amazon or whatever, and get them that way. But the publisher does have the 10% discount. So anyway,
there's the Giza Death Star, the Giza Death Star deployed, the Giza Death Star destroyed, then Reich of the Black Sun, the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and the Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. So if you go to the Byte Show, go to the library, click on Joseph's name. There's a twinkle star there by his name. And click on it, and his page at the Byte Show opens up. There are the audio files, how to order his book, and his email address, and his website address, which is GizaDeathStar.com. Joseph, many blessings to you.
And to you too, GeorgeAnn.
Thank you. These books are a blessing.
Well, thank you.
They open a person's mind up, believe me. And this, right now, will conclude part 6 in our Cosmic War, Giza. And God willing, Joseph and I will be back with a part 7.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, we do have fun.
Yeah, we do.
Okay. So, God bless all of you out there. Go get these books. I'm telling you, get them, and get them now. Good night, everybody.
The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.